Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Kentucky in the year 1834. The forests were darker then, denser, filled with the hum of cicadas and the occasional cry of wolves echoing across the hills. Roads were little more than muddy tracks carved by wagon wheels. In the distance, small cabins stood stubborn against the wilderness, their wooden walls creaking in the wind. It was here, in a farming settlement just beyond the Kentucky River, that the McAllister family welcomed 2 children into the world. Twins. A rare blessing in those days when childbirth was as dangerous as the wilderness outside. But these children, they were unlike anything the midwife had ever seen. The midwife's hands trembled as she held the first boy. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as though the blood beneath it did not flow quite right. His eyes, wide, unblinking, opened far too soon, and she swore he fixed his gaze directly on her, as if he understood. Then came the second twin, and here the unease deepened. He was identical in form, identical in weight, identical in the strange paleness of his skin, but across his chest, in a line that looked almost carved, was a deep mark. A birthmark, yes, but shaped like nothing natural. It curled in spirals, sharp edges like script, too old to be read. The midwife gasped. She had seen birthmarks before, never one that looked written. The McAllister parents, Thomas and Eliza, were simple people, God-fearing, hard-working, but even they froze when the mark was revealed. Eliza clutched her newborns tightly, whispering prayers as though warding off a curse. That night, neighbors crowded into the cabin, bearing bread, blankets, and questions. Word of the strange twins traveled quickly through the settlement. Some dismissed the mark as chance. Others muttered of old sins, witchcraft, or curses carried across bloodlines. Yet one old woman, a widow named Agnes, who claimed Irish descent, muttered a phrase that silenced the room. The same mark was seen in Likeslip. It always means death follows. No one dared ask her what she meant. But from that night on, the McAllister twins were no longer just children. They were omens. In the weeks that followed, neighbors came to see the boys, and each visitor left unsettled. The twins rarely cried. They slept at the same hours, woke at the same hours, moved in uncanny synchrony. If one turned his head, the other mirrored it perfectly. If one clenched his fist, the other followed in the same heartbeat. But what unsettled the villagers most was their eyes. Infants' eyes wander, unfocused, as they learn to see the world. These twins' eyes were steady, tracking faces with unnerving intent. Mothers who visited swore the boys stared too long, too knowingly, as though they were studying, measuring. By the time they were 3 months old, Eliza had stopped inviting neighbors inside. The visits always ended the same, with whispered prayers and hurried exits. Here I must pause, dear listener, because what happened to the McAllister twins in the months that followed defied not only the beliefs of 1834, but the science of today. Before I tell you what happened when the twins spoke their first words no infant should know, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? And if stories like this chill your spine and keep you listening in the dark, then subscribe to Cold Mysteries, because each week we unravel another secret the world tried to bury. Now, let us return to Kentucky, to the cabin where 2 children were born together, but perhaps were never meant to belong to this world at all. Infants should not speak before their first year. Even the brightest rarely form clear words until much later. But the McAllister twins broke this rule before their mother's milk had even dried from their lips. At barely 6 months old, Thomas and Eliza were startled awake one night by a sound. It was not crying, nor the babbling of infants. It was language, clear, deliberate words carried on voices far too young to produce them. Eliza swore later she heard her name, Not just Mama, not the clumsy syllables of a child, but Eliza, spoken in a tone too sharp, too aware. Neighbors were skeptical when Eliza first whispered the tale, until they heard it for themselves. One Sunday afternoon, the family attended church in the small wooden chapel that served as the settlement's heart. The twins, wrapped tightly in swaddling cloths, sat in the pew beside their mother. As the preacher droned on about sin and salvation, a soft voice broke the silence. It came not from the pulpit, but from Eliza's lap. "He lies," the child's voice whispered. Gasps filled the chapel. The preacher froze, his hand trembling on the good book. Thomas clutched his wife's arm, staring at the boys whose lips had barely moved. The voice came again, in the same eerie clarity, this time from the second twin. "God is not listening." The chapel emptied before the sermon was finished, and from that day, families began to avoid the McAllisters. The strangest part was not just what the twins said, but how perfectly they echoed one another. If one spoke, the other finished the thought. If one raised a hand, the other mirrored the gesture exactly. They did not laugh, they did not, except in unison. By their first year, they could walk, yet they moved like shadows of one another, stepping with the same foot, pausing at the same instant, tilting their heads together as though listening to something no one else could hear. Eliza, exhausted and fearful, confessed in her journal that she sometimes could not tell which child was which. Not because of their likeness, but because their actions blurred them into one being. "They are two bodies," she wrote, "but one will." It wasn't long before the settlement's children began to suffer night terrors. Parents reported waking to find their sons and daughters screaming, insisting the McAllister twins had been standing at the foot of their beds, whispering things too dreadful to repeat. Yet the cabin stood miles away, and Thomas swore the boys never left his sight. Still, livestock began to die in strange ways. Chickens bled dry without wounds. Cows refused to feed, staring at the twins with wild eyes whenever they were led near. Dogs growled and would not cross the McAllister threshold. The settlement grew restless, and old Agnes, the Irish widow, repeated her warning. The mark never lies. Blood will pay for blood. Here is where I pause again to ask you, listening now, far from the hills of Kentucky, what do you make of this? Two children, not yet old enough to walk steady, speaking with the clarity of men, words of defiance, words that turned neighbors against them. Do you believe it was merely coincidence and the accident of timing and perception? Or do you think, as the people of 1834 believed, that something darker had taken root in the McAllister cabin? Leave your thoughts below, because the next chapter of this tale grows darker still. By the time the twins reached their second year, Thomas McAllister was a broken man. His fields went untended, his crops failed. His wife no longer sang hymns while she worked, but whispered prayers under her breath, always glancing toward the children as though they might overhear, and overhear they did. For the twins began to repeat her prayers, backwards, word for word, but reversed, spoken in voices too calm, too deliberate. The settlement began to whisper one final word about the McAllister twins. A word no parent wishes to hear in connection with their children. Possessed. But the truth of what they were was something far stranger. By the spring of 1836, the McAllister twins had reached their second birthday. But instead of innocent play, their childhood was defined by a series of disturbing games. Games no ordinary children should have known, let alone devised. Neighbors who braved a visit described a cabin gone silent. No laughter, no crying, no babbling, only whispers and long stretches of quiet, broken by sounds no parent wishes to hear from their children, ritual-like chanting, synchronized footsteps, and long hours of silence broken by a sudden, piercing shriek. The twins never fought. They never argued. Instead, they played in eerie unison, as though obeying the rules of a game too old for anyone else to understand. Eliza wrote of the first game in her journal, calling it the game of the stones. The twins would sit opposite each other on the dirt floor, a pile of small river stones between them. Without speaking, they would begin to move the stones, one by one, arranging them into intricate patterns, spirals, circles, interlocking shapes, always symmetrical, always precise. If one child placed a stone, the other mirrored it without hesitation. Visitors swore the patterns resembled symbols from old Celtic carvings, shapes no frontier child should have seen. Once, Thomas tried to scatter the stones, fearful of what they meant. The twins reacted not with tears, but with laughter, a hollow, mirthless laugh that chilled him to the bone. Within an hour, the stones were back in their places, perfectly aligned. Neither parent claimed to have touched them. Another game unfolded at dusk, when the fading light cast long shadows through the cabin's small windows. The twins would stand together, hands clasped, staring at the wall. Slowly, their shadows would begin to move, out of rhythm with their bodies. Thomas once saw the boys standing still, yet their shadows twisted and bent as though alive. The figures elongated, arms stretching too far, heads tilting at unnatural angles. Eliza fainted the first time she saw it. Thomas refused to speak of it again. But the neighbors noticed too. Children who played nearby swore the twins' shadows followed them, even when the boys remained inside. From that day, no child entered the McAllister yard again. The most unsettling of all was what Eliza called the game of the silence. The twins would sit for hours without moving, staring at each other, their lips pressed shut, their eyes unblinking. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a contest of will. But animals that wandered too close, chickens, dogs, even a neighbor's horse, would freeze in place, eyes rolling, bodies trembling, as though caught in the grip of an unseen force. And when the twins finally ended the silence, speaking a single word in unison, the animals would collapse, dead. No wounds, no blood, only stillness. The settlement's patience wore thin. Whispers turned into meetings, meetings into arguments. Some called for the children to be baptized again, claiming a second sacrament might wash away what clung to them. Others demanded harsher action, that the twins be sent away, perhaps even destroyed. But Thomas, though a proud and God-fearing man, stood firm. "They are my sons," he told the settlement. "And if they are cursed, then it is my curse."
Still fear spread like wildfire. Families began to move away, abandoning fertile land rather than risk raising their children near the McAllisters. Crops went untended, the settlement began to shrink, and through it all, the twins grew stronger. Now I ask you, what do you make of these games?
Children moving stones into ancient patterns, shadows that disobeyed the light, animals collapsing at a whispered word. Would you call it coincidence? Trickery? Or would you, like the settlers of 1834, believe you were witnessing something far darker? Tell us in the comments what you think. And remember, if you want more stories of history's strangest, most chilling secrets, subscribe to Cold Mysteries, because the tale of the twins is only just beginning. As the boys grew, so too did the power of their games. And soon the settlers would witness a display so disturbing, so undeniable, that even Thomas McAllister could no longer protect his sons from suspicion. It began with the death of a neighbor's child, and it would change everything. Every story of suspicion reaches a breaking point, a single moment when whispers turn into accusations and fear becomes action. For the settlement near the Kentucky River, that moment came in the autumn of 1836, when the life of a child was lost. The victim was Sarah Whitcomb, the bright-eyed daughter of a neighboring farmer. Barely 5 years old, she was known for her laugh, a sound that lifted spirits even in the hardest of harvest seasons. But one September evening, her laughter was silenced forever. Sarah had been warned not to approach the McAllister cabin. All the children had. But children are curious, and forbidden places are the most tempting of all. On that day, while her mother prepared supper, Sarah wandered toward the woods where she often played. Her trail ended at the edge of the McAllisters' clearing. Eliza, looking out from her window, later swore she saw the twins standing at the tree line, motionless, their pale faces fixed on the little girl. Sarah called to them, and they turned, in unison, stepping into the woods. She followed. By nightfall, she had not returned. When Sarah's parents realized she was missing, the settlement gathered torches and set out in search. They scoured the forest, calling her name, combing through thickets and streams. Hours passed. The cries of the search party echoed against the hills. And then, silence. One of the men found her first. Sarah lay on the riverbank, her small hands folded neatly over her chest, as though placed there with care. There were no wounds, no blood. Her face was serene, almost peaceful, except for her eyes. They were wide open, staring at something no one else could see, and carved faintly across her chest, visible only in the torchlight, was a spiral mark, identical to the birthmark that
adorned one of the twins. The settlement erupted in fury. Mothers pulled their children close. Fathers shouted for justice. They stormed to the McAllister cabin, torches in hand, demanding the twins be brought out. Thomas stood his ground at the door.
he swore his sons had been inside all evening. Eliza wept behind him, clutching the boys to her chest, but the settlers were not convinced. Too many had seen the twins watching Sarah. Too many had heard the whispers of their games. And now, with
a child dead and marked with their curse, suspicion hardened into certainty. "They've brought the devil among us," one man shouted.
"If we don't act now, none of our children are safe." That night, the settlement held a secret meeting in the chapel. Voices rose, fists pounded against wooden pews. Some argued for exile. Send the family away, cast them out before worse. It could happen. Others, more fearful, whispered of darker solutions. But it was old Agnes, the widow, whose warnings had shadowed the family since the twins' birth, who spoke loudest. "The mark never lies," she declared, "and blood must answer for blood." Her words hung in the air like smoke. And though no formal decision was made, the settlement left that chapel with a shared understanding. The McAllisters' time among them was running out. Back at the cabin, Thomas and Eliza knew what was coming. Thomas sharpened his axe each night, not for wood, but for defense. Eliza stopped writing in her journal, as though recording the truth might seal their fate. The twins, for their part, seemed untouched by the storm gathering around them. They sat together in silence, or played their games, their pale eyes following their parents with unsettling calm. And one night, as the wind howled through the trees, Thomas swore he heard them speaking to each other in perfect unison. 1. Gone. More to come. So now I ask you, what would you have done if you were there that night? Would you have sided with the parents, protecting their children no matter the cost? Or would you have stood with the fearful neighbors, convinced that evil needed to be purged before it spread further? Leave your answer below, because the next turn in this story is darker still. For in the winter of 1836, tragedy did not end with Sarah Whitcomb. Another child vanished, then another, each loss driving the settlement closer to violence. And when the truth came to light, it was not just the twins who stood accused, but the parents who shielded them. The death of Sarah Whitcomb should have been enough to satisfy the settlement's fears. A single tragedy could be mourned, a single loss explained away. But the months that followed proved it was only the beginning, because Sarah was not the last child to vanish. In December of 1836, as the first snow fell heavy on the Kentucky hills, another child went missing. Jacob Miller, son of a blacksmith, was known for sneaking out of his family's cabin to explore the woods. One morning, his bed was found empty, his footprints leading through the snow, straight toward the McAllister clearing. The prince stopped, suddenly, as though Jacob had vanished into thin air. His body was never recovered. But the villagers swore they saw something else in the snow that morning. Smaller footprints, perfectly paired, circling Jacob's trail. 2 sets. Twins. Only weeks later, tragedy struck again. Mary Collins, a farmer's daughter, failed to return home from collecting firewood. Her father searched frantically, and by dusk he found her basket lying at the edge of the woods. The wood was neatly stacked inside, untouched. Nearby, carved into the bark of an oak tree, was a spiral symbol identical to the one on the McAllister boy's chest. Beneath it lay Mary's bonnet, folded as if placed with care. Of the girl herself, there was no trace. By the time the 3rd child was gone, the settlement was no longer a community but a hive of fear.
Mothers locked their doors. Fathers sat awake through the night, rifles across their knees. The chapel, once a place of comfort, became the stage for furious debates. They're witches, some declared. No demons, others argued. A few
whispered the word no one wanted to speak aloud. Angels fallen to earth, not children at all. Old Agnes, ever the loudest, raised her bony finger to the sky and cried, "If you let them live, your own children will pay the price." One by one, until none are left. Her words carried weight. And soon the settlers began preparing not just for defense, but for retribution. Inside their cabin, Thomas and Eliza lived in constant dread. Their neighbors no longer offered help or greetings. Their church pew sat empty. Supplies grew scarce, as no one wished to trade with them. Thomas grew gaunt, his once strong frame bent beneath the weight of fear. Eliza wasted away, her face hollowed by sleepless nights and endless prayers. But the twins, they thrived. Their cheeks remained pale but full, their eyes sharper than ever. And though food was scarce, they never seemed to weaken. In fact, they seemed to grow stronger with every child that vanished. One evening, as Thomas returned from a desperate hunt, he found the boys crouched together in the corner of the cabin, whispering over something clutched in their small hands. When he stepped closer, his heart froze. It was a ribbon, bright red, frayed at the edges,
identical to the one Sarah Whitcomb had worn in her hair the day she died. Thomas snatched it away, shouting, demanding to know where they had found it. The twins only smiled, their lips curling in perfect unison. "She gave it to us," they
said softly. Before she slept, the ribbon, though Thomas never showed it to anyone, became the breaking point. Word spread quickly that the boys were keeping trophies, tokens of the dead. By February, families began fleeing the settlement entirely. Cabins stood empty, fields abandoned, livestock left to wander. Those who remained gathered nightly, their fear transforming into fury. A plan was whispered, then spoken aloud. Drive the McAllisters out, or bury them with the others. So here I ask you, what would you have believed, standing in that chapel, watching families disappear, one after
another?
Would you cling to reason, insisting there must be another explanation? Or would you have joined the growing chorus calling for blood? Tell us what you would have done. Because in the next chapter, the settlement does not hesitate. They take action, and the horror that follows still stains Kentucky's history. For when spring arrived in 1837, the settlers no longer whispered. They marched, and the McAllister cabin, once a home of sorrow, became the stage for a confrontation that would leave no soul untouched. By the spring of 1837, the settlement was no longer divided. Fear had forged unity. The vanishings, the marks, the whispers. In the night, they all pointed to the same place, the McAllister cabin. And so, on a cold April evening, the settlers gathered. 20 men armed with rifles and torches. Their wives and children stood behind them, silent, their faces pale in the flickering light. No one spoke of law, or scripture, or mercy. They spoke only of survival. And when the torches were lit, the
march began. Eliza was the first to hear them, the crunch of boots in the dirt, the hiss of torches in the dark.
She clutched the twins to her chest, her heart pounding. Thomas stepped outside, axe in hand, his shoulders squared, though his frame trembled. The mob stopped at the edge of the clearing. At their front stood Joseph Whitcomb, Sarah's grieving
father. His face was hollowed by loss, his eyes burning with something more than grief. "Bring out the boys," Joseph demanded. "Let us see their faces when God's truth is spoken." Thomas shook his head. "They are my sons, and you'll not harm them." But the crowd pressed forward, shouting now, the chapel's old wooden cross raised high above their heads like a weapon. The settlers fanned out, circling the cabin. Flames licked the night sky as torches were thrust
into the dry grass. Smoke began to rise. Inside, Eliza fell to her knees, praying aloud. The twins stood silently side by side, their pale eyes unblinking as the walls of their home glowed orange. Thomas barred the door with timber, shouting for the mob to stop.
But the voices outside grew louder, their fury swelling into a chant, "Witch sons, devilkin, blood for blood." The McAllister cabin was no longer a home. It was a fortress under siege. And then something happened. The twins stepped forward,
slipping from their mother's grasp. They pressed their small hands flat against the wooden door. And as the mob prepared to strike it down, a sound rose from within the cabin. Not the cry of children, not the wail of parents, but a low, resonant hum. The settlers froze, torches trembling. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the air, through their bones. Windows rattled, smoke swirled in unnatural patterns, curling into shapes that resembled faces, hollow-eyed, screaming faces, and then the door burst open. But it was not Thomas, nor Eliza, who stood there. It was the twins. Their faces were calm, their eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, and in perfect unison they spoke a single word: sleep. One by one the settlers collapsed. Torches fell, rifles clattered to the ground, men, women, even children, all crumpled where they stood as though their strings had been cut. Only Joseph Whitcomb remained upright, his grief burning too fiercely to be subdued. He raised his rifle, aiming at the boys. His finger trembled on the trigger, but before he could fire, he staggered, clutching his chest. The rifle slipped from his grasp, and he fell to the dirt, his eyes wide with shock. When the settlers awoke, hours later, dawn breaking through the smoke, Joseph's body lay cold. His face bore no wounds, only the same wide-eyed terror Sarah had worn. When word spread of what had happened at the cabin, the settlement dissolved. Families abandoned their homes overnight, wagons creaking down the muddy roads, never to return. The chapel doors were nailed shut. The fields lay untended. Within weeks, the land around the McAllisters stood empty, save for the cabin at its center, and the twins who had silenced an entire community with a single word. And here, dear listener, I turn the question to you. What would you have done standing among that mob? Would you have raised your torch, certain you were purging evil? Or would you have dropped to your knees, begging mercy from children who wielded power no human should?
Tell us your answer, because the tale of the twins does not end with a broken settlement. No, their story spreads far beyond those Kentucky woods. For when news of the strange children reached the ears of traveling preachers and scholars, the
McAllister's tragedy became something else entirely. A case, a legend, a mystery that even science itself would attempt, and fail, to explain. The collapse of the Kentucky settlement should have been the end of the story. A cabin abandoned, a family shunned, a tragedy left to rot in memory. But stories like these do not stay buried. They travel, carried on whispers, on sermons, on the shaky words of those who fled, And within a year, the McAllister twins were no longer just a local terror. They had become a mystery that drew men of faith and men of science. In the summer of 1837, a circuit preacher named Reverend Elias Boone arrived at the clearing. He had heard rumors of demon children haunting the woods, and he came armed with scripture and zeal. Thomas, weary but still protective, allowed the man inside. Eliza watched from the corner, her face pale, her hands trembling over her rosary. Boone wasted no time. He placed his Bible on the table, open to the Gospel of Mark, and commanded the twins to speak. At first, silence. Then, in perfect unison, the boys recited the passage aloud, backwards, every word, every syllable, inverted, yet flawless. The Reverend fled the cabin before finishing his prayer. Days later, his horse was found riderless miles away, his belongings scattered, his tracks ending abruptly in the woods. Boone himself was never seen again. Months later came Dr. Jeremiah Harlan, a physician from Lexington who had heard tales of children immune to hunger and disease. He arrived with instruments, notebooks, and the certainty of science. Thomas resisted at first, but hunger drove him to accept the doctor's offer of coin. Harlan examined the boys by lamplight, recording,
Every detail. He pricked their skin, but no blood rose.
He measured their pulses, and found them irregular, one always slightly behind the other, as though echoing the beat of a single heart. When he asked them simple questions, they responded with knowledge no child could have, reciting anatomy, describing the stars, even naming herbs Harlan himself had studied in medical school. Shaken, the doctor left abruptly. His notes, discovered years later in a Lexington archive, ended with a single line. If these boys are human, then humanity is not what I believed it to be. In early 1838, a man named Declan Moore, an Irish immigrant and amateur folklorist, sought the twins, drawn by tales of the spiral mark. He claimed the symbol matched carvings he had seen in Ireland, connected to ancient druidic rites. Moore spent 3 days in the McAllister cabin, listening, watching, recording. On the final night, he asked the twins where they had learned such games, such words, such knowledge. They answered in perfect calm, "We remember." Moore left before dawn, pale and shaking. His journals, found after his death in New York, describe the twins as children, not of years, but of centuries, eyes too old for their faces, voices that remember when the world was young. By now, the McAllister twins were no longer just a local tale. They had become a story told in taverns, whispered in sermons, published in small-town newspapers that called them everything from witch spawn to miracles of medicine. But one detail remained consistent. Everyone who came too close to the twins left changed. Some vanished. Some abandoned their faith. Others spoke only in broken whispers, refusing to explain what they had seen. The twins themselves remained untouched, unchanged, as if the chaos around them only made them stronger. So I ask you, what do you think these outsiders saw? Were they facing two cursed children marked by something ancient? Or were they glimpsing the edge of knowledge humanity was not yet ready to touch? Write your thoughts below. And remember, subscribe to Cold Mysteries for more tales like this, where the lines between science and superstition blur into nightmare. For by 1839, the McAllister twins were no longer curiosities. They had become a danger. And when tragedy struck within their own family, even Thomas and Eliza could no longer deny the truth. The twins were not children to be raised, they were forces to be survived. Until 1839, the horror of the McAllister twins had always fallen on outsiders, neighbors, travelers, the unlucky few who crossed their path. But that year, the shadow came home, and when it did, even Thomas and Eliza could no longer deny the truth. The danger did not surround their sons, it was their sons. Eliza McAllister had withered since the twins' birth. Once strong and joyful, she now moved like a shadow of herself. Her cheeks were hollow, her voice brittle. She spent her days clutching her rosary, whispering prayers, refusing to look her sons directly in the eye. Her journal entries from that year, some of the last she would ever write, were filled with despair. They do not sleep. They only pretend. At night I hear them whisper, and when I rise to see, their lips are still. I no longer dream. They take my dreams from me. By summer, Eliza had grown too weak to rise from bed. Thomas begged neighbors for medicine, but none would come near. She was left to waste away in the cabin under the unblinking gaze of the twins. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Eliza beckoned her husband close. Her voice was little more than a breath. "Thomas," she whispered, "you
must take them away. They are not ours. They are not children. They are a door, and it is opening." Those were her final words. That night, Eliza McAllister died. But death did not bring silence.
It brought something worse. When Thomas broke the news to the boys, hoping against reason that they might finally show grief, they did not cry. They did not even blink. Instead, they turned their gaze to their father and spoke together in that too calm, too old voice. "She is not gone. She is with us now." That night, Thomas awoke to a sound that froze his blood. From the corner of the cabin, in the twins' voices, came the whisper of a woman's prayer. Eliza's prayer. Word for word, tone for tone, as though she were still, alive, but spoken from the lips of her sons. Grief consumed Thomas. He raged, he wept, he cursed God. And then, one night, his grief twisted into resolve. He took his axe from the corner, the same axe he had carried since the first mob had come, to his door. He stood over the boys as they slept, or pretended to sleep, his arms shaking with fury. But as he raised the blade, the twins opened their eyes. Together, in perfect unison, they whispered, "Do it! We dare you!" Thomas dropped the axe. He fell to his knees, broken. The boys closed their eyes again, their breathing steady, their small chests rising and falling in eerie rhythm. And Thomas realized then that he was no longer their protector. He was their prisoner. In the weeks after Eliza's death, the cabin changed. The air grew colder, no matter the season. Food spoiled faster. Candles guttered without cause. And at night, Thomas swore he heard his wife's footsteps in the next
room, though her body lay buried beneath the old oak tree outside. The twins grew stronger.
Their games became darker. Stones were arranged into shapes Thomas dared not disturb. The silence games stretched for hours, leaving the cabin heavy with dread, and always they whispered their mother's voice, as though she had never left. So,
I ask you, what would you have done in Thomas's place? Would you have raised the axe, ending the nightmare even at the cost of your soul? Or would you, like him, fall to your knees before the impossible? Tell us in the comments below.
And remember, subscribe to Cold Mysteries if you dare to follow us deeper into stories where love, grief, and horror blur into one. For Eliza's death was not the end. It was the beginning of the final act, because in 1840 the McAllister twins left their cabin. And when they did, the horror that followed would not be confined to one family or one settlement, but would spread across Kentucky like a plague. By 1840, the McAllister cabin was no longer a home. It was a tomb for Eliza's memory, for Thomas's sanity, and for the fragile hope that the twins were anything close to human. And then, one night, they left. Two pale figures, no, taller than a man's waist, walking side by side into the Kentucky woods. Their father watched from the doorway, powerless, broken. He did not call out, he did not follow. Perhaps he believed their departure was a blessing, but what followed proved otherwise. The twins' first appearance outside the clearing was in the small river town of Harrodsburg. They arrived on foot, barefoot, their clothes ragged, their faces unnervingly calm. No one saw who brought them there. No wagon driver, no family escort. They simply appeared at dawn, sitting together on the steps of the town's general store. The shopkeeper, uneasy but compassionate, gave them bread. He would later swear that neither child chewed, but the food vanished all the same. By nightfall, whispers spread. The boys never blinked, they never laughed. They sat in silence until asked a question, and then spoke in voices too measured, too old for children their age. One evening the twins were seen near a tavern where travellers drank and sang loudly. The laughter died when the boys entered. Patrons swore the air grew colder, the fire dimmed, the smell of smoke turned sour. When the innkeeper asked their names, they replied in unison, "We are many!" That night, a traveller was found dead in his bed. No wounds, no struggle, only eyes frozen open in terror, a faint spiral carved into the wood above his pillow. By morning, the boys were gone. From Harrodsburg, the stories multiplied. Some claimed the boys travelled east, others swore they headed north. Always the same reports: livestock dead without cause, children struck by fevers that no doctor could explain, fires starting without flame. In one town, a schoolteacher recorded how the twins stood outside her classroom window for hours, watching. The next day, 3 of her students collapsed during lessons, their lips whispering words in a language no one recognized. The teacher left town soon after, her sanity broken. Her final letter ended with the chilling line, "They are not twins, they are one." Back at the cabin, Thomas McAllister lingered alone. His crops rotted, his hair whitened within a year. Neighbors who dared to approach claimed he had gone half mad, speaking only in fragments. When asked about his sons, he repeated the same phrase again and again. They walk together, but they
are not walking this earth alone. Thomas vanished in the winter of 1841. His axe was found embedded in the cabin door, but his body was never recovered.
Some say he followed his sons into the woods. Others claim the twins returned for him. Whatever the truth, the McAllister name died with him. Over the years, sightings of the twins stretched beyond Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, even whispers as far as Illinois. Always the same, 2 pale boys walking side by side, speaking too little, knowing too much, and wherever they appeared, tragedy followed. Crops failed, children sickened, livestock vanished, families moved, towns shrank. Some believed they were demons in disguise. Others believed they were the result of some forgotten experiment, nature's mistake, left loose in the world. But most agreed on one thing. They could not be stopped. They appeared when least expected and vanished when pursuit grew close, as though the land itself was carrying them forward. So I ask you, listener, if you lived in 19th century Kentucky and 2 children with faces like mirrors walked into your town,
what would you do? Would you offer them bread and shelter as Harrodsburg did? Or would you drive them out, risking their wrath? And if they spoke to you in unison, calm, steady, impossible, would you believe you were hearing children? Or
something much older wearing their skin? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Cold Mysteries, because the trail of the twins doesn't end here. For the last great mystery of the McAllister twins lies not in Kentucky, nor in the towns they haunted, but in the silence that followed them. Because one day, in the early 1840s, the twins disappeared.
As suddenly as they had arrived, and what they left behind
is perhaps the most disturbing clue of all. For nearly a decade, the McAllister twins wandered across the frontier like a curse carried by the wind. Wherever they appeared, silence followed. Wherever they stayed, death soon came. But in the early 1840s, the story reached its strangest and final turn. The twins disappeared. The final confirmed sighting came from a farmer outside Madison, Indiana, in the spring of 1843. He claimed he saw 2 pale boys walking barefoot across his fields just before dawn. their heads turned in unison, their eyes fixing
on him with unnatural calm. He shouted, demanded to know who they were, where they came from. They answered softly together, "We are going home." And then they vanished into the woods. The farmer searched for hours, but no tracks were found.
no broken branches, no disturbed soil. It was as if the boys had dissolved into the morning mist. A year later, hunters stumbled upon the ruins of an old cabin deep in the Kentucky wilderness. Charred timbers, collapsed walls. But inside, something stranger still. 2 small beds, perfectly made, side by side. On the floor between them lay a spiral of stones, carefully arranged, untouched by wind or time. And on the back wall, carved deep into the blackened wood, were words written in crude but deliberate letters. "We remember." The hunters fled and told their story in hushed tones. Some believed it was the McAllister cabin itself, returned to ash. Others insisted it was something else, a place the twins had built or been led to before they vanished. Though their bodies were never found, whispers of the twins persisted. For decades, railway workers in Ohio swore they saw 2 pale young men walking the tracks at night, speaking in unison, their eyes reflecting lantern light. In Illinois, a minister claimed that during a sermon, 2 strangers in the back pew began to repeat his words aloud, backwards,